All right. So we talked about Teotihuacan, we talked about Monte Alban and the Maya all during the Classic period. Now we'll end off talking about the beginning of the Post-Classic period and one of the more powerful peoples that lived in central Mexico, the Toltecs. All right, so who are the Toltecs? Well, they were a multi-ethnic people, meaning that there were a couple of different ethnicities that made up the Toltec people in general. The first and probably more dominant group was the Tolteca Chichimeca. Now, the term Chichimeca applies to a number of different tribal peoples who lived north of central Mexico. Now, in the areas north of central Mexico, there wasn't a lot of rainfall, and so you don't see agricultural-based societies developing there. Instead, in the areas north of central Mexico, you have a number of hunter-gatherer peoples who were considered to be uncivilized in comparison to the agricultural civilizations that developed in central Mexico and to the south. And so these were the Chichimecas who lived in the north, right? They were considered uncivilized. They didn't wear cotton clothing like the members of civilizations in central Mexico did. They just wore animal hides, and they wore very simple sandals made out of yucca fibers from the yucca plant, and they hunted rabbits and they collected seeds. And so the Chichimeca were considered uncivilized. And they didn't develop agriculture because they couldn't, because there was not enough rainfall in the areas where they lived. But there were different types of Chichimeca groups, right, or tribes. Some groups who lived closer to central Mexico could do a little farming if their area had enough adequate rainfall. And so these were known as Tamime Chichimeca. And the Tamime Chichimeca, basically, they were considered partially civilized, okay, to the point where they did a little bit of farming, but they did mostly lived off of hunting and gathering, and they may have worn some ragged-looking clothing, cotton clothing, instead of wearing the animal hides, such as the full-on Chichimeca who lived to the north. And so the Tamime Chichimeca were considered half-civilized, and it is believed that the Toltecs, or the Tolteca Chichimeca, were probably these types of Tamime Chichimeca, right? These half-civilized Chichimecas who eventually started to invade into the area of central Mexico. Okay, so the Tolteca Chichimeca, that is one of the ethnic groups that make up the Toltecs. The other ethnic group that made up the Toltecs was a group called the Nonoalca. Nonoalca, these are civilized peoples who came from the south, from the area of Puebla. And so these were builders who were brought in to the capital city of the Toltecs, known as Tula or Tolan, to build the pyramids and temples and structures of that city. Okay, and eventually the Nonoalca would stay there, and they would become part of the Toltecs, right? So they were a civilized group from the region of Puebla. So those two ethnic groups, the Nonoalca and the Tolteca Chichimeca, made up the Toltecs, right? It's important that we bring that up because eventually those groups will come into conflict with each other and will lead to the decline of the Toltecs, okay? So from their capital city of Tula, the Toltecs would go on to dominate all of central Mexico. Now this is after the fall of Teotihuacan, right? So during the Classic period, Teotihuacan has already fallen. Now during this post-Classic period, you're going to have the Toltecs starting to dominate central Mexico, all right? And they're going to dominate the trade routes as well. They're well known for their military prowess, meaning that they were a powerful militarized civilization. And so they dominated the trade in that region. It's debatable whether they actually developed an actual empire or not. Some say they did, but most believe that the Toltecs did not have an actual full-functioning empire, but they just dominated the trade of central Mexico. Some important individuals that we'll talk about, some of them may have been legendary, may not have actually existed, and some of them actually may have. First, we'll talk about Mixcoatl. Now, Mixcoatl is most likely a legendary leader, meaning that he's just a person of legend. He may not have actually existed, but it is believed amongst the Toltecs of that time that Mixcoatl brought them into central Mexico from the area that they originally migrated from, north of central Mexico. And this was during a time period where a number of different Chichimeca groups were invading into central Mexico. Teotihuacan had fallen, there was no big dominant power controlling central Mexico at that time, and so the doors were open for Chichimeca groups to invade in that area. Also, there was a drought going on at that time, which may have affected the lifestyles of the Chichimeca to the north, which could be another cause behind their invasions into central Mexico. All right. So Mixcoatl is this legendary leader who is said to have brought the Tolteca Chichimeca into central Mexico. Before they went to the city of Tolon, they went to the city of Colhuacan, and that's where the Toltecs originally settled down before they moved to their capital city eventually of Tula. Another important leader of the Toltecs that we have to talk about is Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. Okay, Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. Now, Topiltzin was famous, for one, for establishing the capital city of Tula. Now, there's a whole mythological story behind Topiltzin and his travels and eventually his exile from Tula. We won't go all the way into that, but the idea is that Topiltzin got into conflict with a god known as Tezcatlipoca, or the Smoking Mirrors. This is a god who is symbolized as being the giver and the taker of all life, Tezcatlipoca. And so there is a period of time where Tezcatlipoca and Topiltzin are battling back and forth. Basically, Tezcatlipoca is making Topiltzin's life a living hell. And ultimately, through this conflict that Topiltzin has with Tezcatlipoca, he's eventually going to lead to him leaving in exile from the city of Tula. Okay, so basically, Topiltzin, he establishes the city. He gets into conflict with this god called Tezcatlipoca, and then because of this conflict, ultimately, he is going to leave his city of Tula. Okay, so Topiltzin goes into exile, and it is said that he went to the coast, right? Most likely the east coast, right, by the Gulf of Mexico, and that he sailed away, and that there was this prophecy that one day he would return back to his city to reclaim his throne. Right? Now, maybe you've heard this story before in connection with the Aztecs, right? This idea that Quetzalcoatl would return, and that the Aztecs, that Moctezuma thought that the Spanish were actually Quetzalcoatl, that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl returning to take over his throne. Well, that's the same story. The story of Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, who was forced to leave in exile but vowed to return one day to his city and take back his throne. That's what the Aztecs were referring to, if it was even true, when it is said that they believed that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl, right? So the story goes that Topiltzin left in exile. He leaves off into the sea, and he's not heard from again, but he's supposed to return. Okay, he's supposed to return in the year 1 Reed, the same year that he was born, and that's the same year that Cortez was said to have arrived in the calendar. I'm skeptical on that, and there are other scholars who are skeptical on whether the Aztecs actually thought Cortez was Quetzalcoatl, but that's a whole other story. We'll talk more about that later. But anyway, there is some evidence that points to the fact that Topiltzin may have actually existed. He may have not just been a legendary leader, he may have been a real person. And what is this evidence? Well, the year given for the lifetime of Topiltzin, the years given when he was supposed to have actually lived, coincide with the same years that a Toltec force, an invading force, landed in the Yucatan and took over an area known as Chichen Itza. So this is interesting. Okay, it's around the same period of time that Topiltzin was said to have lived, and maybe he did, get on a raft and go out into the sea and sail to the Yucatan, where him and his group, because he wasn't by himself, he had a number of followers who went with him. Maybe they did get onto a sea craft and land in the Yucatan and end up taking over the Mayan city of Chichen Itza. There's a lot of evidence that show that there was most likely a Toltec force who did invade around that same time period and took control of the city of Chichen Itza, which was a Mayan city beforehand. Now, what is some of this evidence? Well, let's take a look at some of the visual evidence. Okay, we can take a look at some pictures here. Here is Tula in central Mexico. This is where Tolpiltzin would be traveling from. So the story goes that Tolpiltzin would go to the coast, to the Gulf of Mexico, get on a raft, and him and his followers would eventually land in the Yucatan and conquer this Mayan city of Chichen Itza. Okay, it's a possibility. It's around the same time period. Okay, so that's somewhat of a connection, but we can't prove it just because it was around the same time period, right? Well, let's take a look at some of the architecture. Here is the city of Tula. Okay, this is what the city of Tula looks like. Right, this is what Tolpiltzin would have been leaving around that time. And here's another picture, a close-up. These are known as the Atlantids. These are 4 warriors who sit atop of this pyramid temple here that we were looking at earlier. And here is a picture of Chichen Itza. Okay, you can see you have these large pillars in front of a pyramid. Looks like very similar type of architecture, right? And this is not a Mayan style of architecture. The Mayan city-states didn't necessarily look like this. So there's definitely a Central Mexican theme in the architecture here. Looks very similar to what you see in Tula. And so that's why scholars believe that the Toltecs invaded Chichen Itza and dominated for a period of time, okay? Because of that evidence. Alright, so that's the connection between the Toltecs and Chichen Itza and evidence that shows that maybe Tolpiltzin might have existed. Another thing, one last thing on that, is that the Mayan history of Chichen Itza says that the city was invaded and conquered by a leader by the name of Kukulkan. And what does Kukulkan mean? Kukulkan means the feathered serpent in the Mayan language, in that particular Mayan dialect. Okay, and what is Tolpiltzin's name? Tolpiltzin Quetzalcoatl, and Quetzalcoatl means the feathered serpent. Okay, so Tolpiltzin Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, may have actually gone to the Yucatan and conquered Chichen Itza. All right, the Mayans say there was some ruler who invaded and conquered, and his name was the feathered serpent. So hey, the time periods add up, the architecture adds up. Tolpiltzin may have existed. Okay, all right, finally, we'll talk about the decline of Tula. Ultimately, the Toltecs will lose power, and this is most likely due to a drought. And that drought, with a lack of rainfall, is going to limit the amount of agricultural crops that they can grow to sustain the city. And so this may have led to conflict between the different ethnic groups, the Nonualca and the Tolteca Chichimeca, that made up the Toltecs. So it is most likely that conflict between these two groups led to the downfall of Tula, and ultimately you'll have the Toltecs migrating away from their capital city of Tula, and some will remain behind, but after that Tula has lost its power. It's not the dominant force, that military force that it once was. Okay, and after the fall of Tula, it's very important to know that the Toltecs would migrate to a number of different areas, and they would end up conquering or dominating culturally those areas in central Mexico. So after the fall of the Toltecs, you would have a number of Toltec refugees who would establish or come to dominate city-states in central Mexico. Okay, so after the fall of the Toltecs, there's not one dominant power. There's just a number of different city-states there in central Mexico, and a lot of them are being ruled or influenced by these Toltecs who migrated out of Tula after its collapse. Okay, that's important because that's setting the stage for what the Aztecs will find when they migrate into central Mexico. Right, these number of different city-states and not one power, not one major empire.